The Boer War has been going on for 3 years. During that time, there is a lot of controversy that comes out of it, a lot of problems that come for a lot of people. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what those problems are, what happens in response, and where it takes things in the future. This is kind of the first time modern warfare is seen in all of its ugliness, and probably the first time where most Europeans understand this in a way that they didn't prior to this. And I think that's important as we move on into the story of the 20th century. Curioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 257, The Horrors of War. We're in a period where Wales is adjusting to the turn of the century, all the problems that come with it, a change in the monarchy, which will happen very shortly after this, and all of the fundamental issues that are going on both at home and abroad. And of course, Britain is ensconced in a war called the Boer War, which goes on for about 3 years. And that war will wrap up by 1902. But at the same time, there are people in Britain who are starting to oppose the war, are starting to feel a lot less secure and a lot less believing in what they're being told by the government. And some people didn't believe it to begin with. One of the strongest anti-war voices in Britain is David Lloyd George. By early 1900, Lloyd George had become one of the leading critics of the war in Parliament. In the Hansard for the 6th of February 1900, it records his attacks on the government strategy and his warnings about the human cost of the conflict. His speeches in Wales provoked violent reactions. At Bangor on the 4th of January that year, the South Wales Daily News reported chair-throwing, shouts of treason, and attempts to storm the platform over what he was expressing. So you can see there's a lot of conflict here. Keir Hardie, visiting Aberdare in December of 1899, had been recorded by the Merthyr Times, telling the crowd that the war is a rich man's quarrel and that working men should not be sacrificing themselves for imperial adventure. Along with this anti-war sentiment, both from a practical and from a peace perspective, we also have another one, which is pacifists. Welsh chapels in Gwynedd passed pacifist resolutions in early 1900. The Baptist Times published sermons by Reverend John Clifford condemning the war on moral grounds. So there's a movement not just of actively stating that the war shouldn't be happening or stating that the way that the war is going is bad, but also saying that maybe there shouldn't be a war at all, and maybe as an individual, we should not be fighting in wars. All of this gets magnified by characters that are around in this period who are experiencing the war firsthand. We've talked a tiny bit in the previous episode about Emily Hobhouse and the effect that she had on raising the attention of the populations back home on what was going on in South Africa. She becomes one of the most significant humanitarian voices in the Boer War, and her work profoundly influenced opinion in Wales. Understanding her contribution requires looking at why she went to South Africa and what she discovered there. Emily was the secretary of the South African Women and Children Distress Fund, founded in late 1900 to provide humanitarian relief. As you can imagine, the fund's purpose is documented in its official circulars and its own correspondence published later in her Report of a Visit to Certain Camps of Women and Children, published in June of 1901. She traveled to South Africa at her own initiative, with the permission of the Colonial Office, believing that British women had a moral duty to address the suffering created by the war. Her arrival at Cape Town in the 27th of December, 1900, is confirmed by newspapers of the day who noted both her arrival and also the surviving letters that were held in a library, which kept track of her movements. In what she discovered, of course, were camps, and in these camps, people, civilians, had been put into. They become called by the British military concentration camps. The camps emerged from the British military police during the guerrilla phase of the war. After the fall of Pretoria, Boer commandos continued fighting as mobile irregular bands. To remove local support and supplies, Lord Kitchener had introduced a scorched earth policy. Farms were burned, livestock seized, and rural families displaced. To manage the displaced civilians, the British created refugee camps, which soon became mandatory and were effectively what we know of as concentration camps. Now, we're not talking about extermination camps. A lot of us, when we think concentration camps, that's the first thing that comes to mind is what happened to the Jewish people and others, minorities in World War II. This is different than that. So we have to keep that in mind. We're not talking about that. This is more like the equivalent would be more like a prisoner of war camp or a refugee camp, but it's a mandatory refugee camp, and it is a very similar to a POW camp. You're not allowed to leave, and you're completely restricted by whatever the government wants of you, and it's not aimed at prisoners of war, but rather civilians. So that's why it's different but similar. So in a way, it's no better in some respects. Let's keep that in mind. But it does definitely not go the way that the Nazi movement was going with their version of this and in the extermination camps that they create later in World War II. These camps were run by the army, and they were overcrowded and extremely poorly supplied. I'm sure that comes as no shock to most people. By early 1901, 100,000 civilians, primarily women and children, were interred in these concentration camps. Hobhouse visited numerous camps, including ones in Bloemfontein, Norval, Spont, Kimberley, and Orange River. Her findings are not speculative, but rather they come from her reports of the visits and the letters she wrote and the testimony she gave to the Ladies' Commission later. And what she reported is shocking. Certainly, it stunned the British public back home. She reported of overcrowded tents holding entire families, severe shortages of clothing and blankets, inadequate sanitation, a lack of soap which prevented basic hygiene, food rations too small to maintain health, widespread disease including measles, pneumonia, and dysentery, and extremely high child mortality. In Bloemfontein alone, she recorded 344 deaths in the month of January 1901, most of them children. Her line was, "I call this camp a death trap," in one of the reports that was published. Hobhouse revelation caused a strong reaction in Britain, and in Wales specifically. Welsh newspapers covered her findings extensively. The Cambrian, when it published its opinion, praised her courage. The Western Mail printed detailed reports, as did the South Wales Daily News, which demanded parliamentary action in the matter. It's funny to me when you look at how the poor, for example, are dealt with in Britain at this time, and just the way in general that British thought processes had generally worked on official views, that there wasn't a better understanding of the public that this was probably always going to be the situation. They didn't really have enough of a concept. It was almost like they were blinded by the patriotism and the success to not see the damage that was happening. And you can kind of see how this occurs. I mean, we see it in this day and age. A lot of times when countries go to war, the people in that country who believe in what the war is about are talking patriotically about everything, and anybody talking bad about the government is looked down on. You can see that as a result in our own lives. If you're born at a certain age, you remember 9/11 and the aftermath of that and the debates that surrounded that issue and the subsequent invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and how people divided on either side, and how those on the side that were anti the war were severely called out by some people and some organizations as being unpatriotic. There's all this kind of going on. Well, it's no different in this age. There's a lot of people who don't necessarily know fully what's happened. They are living their own lives and don't understand or don't have the background or the information to understand properly. And it's only as these news reports are coming out from people on the ground that they suddenly start to realize just how bad things are. And in a way, not unlike today, there's a lot of times where we are closeted into our little information booths and we don't really know a lot about things that happen outside of where we're at. I had something happen over the last couple of weeks that got brought up to me, and did I hear about this because this was happening to someone? And I said, no, I had no idea this was going on. And I looked online to see if it was actually in the news at all, and it wasn't in the news. So it's impossible to get any clue of this. And this comes about in part for a number of different reasons in the modern age. But in this day and age, back in the beginning of the 1900s, you're talking about a very narrow amount of information coming out from a very narrow amount of people. And generally, people didn't necessarily believe things that were told by non-local sources. So, if you're hearing from, say, the New York Times and you live in London or in Cardiff or in Wrexham, you may not believe what the New York Times is saying about a war where they're writing in a more neutral standpoint, or say, somebody from Paris writing about it. All of those things may slant your viewpoint away from that. And similarly, this comes about in these circumstances. And so it takes your people telling you what's going on for you to understand and you to come to grips with just how bad things are. And of course, as this is going on and as the news is leaking back home, or in this case, flooding back home with much information, women's groups responded quickly. The South Wales Women's Liberal Association passed resolutions supporting Hobhouse and calling for an inquiry. These minutes are in the National Library of Wales, should you ever be curious to check them out. Chapel debates also reflected the shock. Congregations in Cardiff, Swansea, and Llandudnos discussed the moral implications of the camps as printed in various church circulars. The ministers themselves compared the suffering of the children to the biblical admonition against such unjust leadership. And in an era when Christianity is still very strong, this comparison between doing good and right by the women and the children would have been still at the top of mind of a lot of people. And the fact that, let's be a little blunt here, the fact that these people are similar to you, they're European, likely in heritage, makes it a little bit easier to sympathize with them than, say, if they were from a different background in a different part of the world, where it's easier to kind of write it off as, oh, they're not one of us, so to speak. And the rightness and wrongness of that's pretty obvious, but I just want to make it clear that it makes it mildly more sympathetic to this group of people. Hobhouse's report directly led to the creation of the Fawcett Commission, an all-women investigative body that was sent by the British government to find out what was going on, and their findings confirmed her observations, leading to reforms in camp administration. For many in Wales, Hobhouse became a symbol of moral responsibility during the war. Her work provided the documented evidence that shifted public debate from patriotic support to a more complex conversation about humanitarian duty and the ethics of empire. But of course, she was not alone in giving reports back to the people of the UK and Wales in particular. Nurse Catherine Jenkins of Swansea stands out as one of the best documented Welsh women who served in South Africa during the Boer War. Her story survives through contemporary Welsh newspapers, the Queen's South Africa medal rolls, and the official list of nurses attached to colonial hospitals in that period. Catherine Jenkins was born in Swansea and trained as a nurse in the 1890s. Her professional background is referenced in local reports that accounted of her departure. In March of 1901, the Cambrian Daily Leader and the Cambrian newspaper described her as a respected nurse volunteering to assist the military medical mission in South Africa. According to the Queen's South Africa Medal Roll for the nursing staff, Jenkins embarked in early 1901 with a group of nurses assigned to hospital duty in Bloemfontein. The medal roll listed her under the Natal and Orange River Colony Medical Services. Her departure received public attention. A farewell gathering was reported in Swansea County Herald on the 8th of March, where colleagues presented her with traveling cases and letters of support. These reinforce that the Welsh community was trying to be attentive and responsive to these kind of movements. Now, she would write letters that would then be sent from Bloemfontein back to Wales, and only a few months later, she became witness to the horrors of war in ways most civilians at this point had not been exposed to. And most valuable of her surviving sources, of course, were the letters that were published in newspapers in the period. These letters offered a clear, documented view of the humanitarian crisis she was witnessing. Jenkins served at the Bloemfontein concentration camp hospital, which became one of the hardest hit by the outbreak of measles, typhoid, and dysentery. She wrote that she cared for the children who arrived, quote, so weak they could scarcely lift their heads, end quote. That shortages of blankets, soap, and proper food made recovery almost impossible, and that many children were in a, quote, state of near starvation, end quote, when they were brought to hospital. That the medical staff struggled daily against overwhelming numbers of patients flooding in and the consequences of everything that was happening to them. These conditions, of course, matched those that were recorded by Emily Hobhouse, as well as the later Fawcett Commission findings, demonstrating the reliability of what Jenkins was saying. Jenkins also described the difficulty of treating measles and pneumonia in tents exposed to cold night winds. She wrote that the tents were crowded with sick children and exhausted mothers, inadequate supplies of disinfectant, and entire families arriving barefoot and wearing the same clothes they had worn for months. And long days were spent dressing wounds and comforting these dying children. Her comments on the emotional strain are some of the strongest in the surviving Welsh accounts of the war. In one letter, she wrote that the suffering, quote, weighs upon the heart heavily, end quote, and that many nurses would cry after their shifts, which, I mean, dealing with children in that regard, I can totally understand. The reaction of the public was obviously strong. There were editorials that praised Jenkins for her courage and honesty. The Welsh liberal women's groups referenced her letters and debates recorded in the South Wales Women's Liberal Association minutes. Nonconformist ministers would cite her testimony in chapel sermons condemning the treatment of civilians, and her letters became a part of the evidence that convinced many in Britain that the war involved a profound moral crisis. By early 1902, her name appeared again in the Swansea Court Herald, which reported her return and noted that she had completed her term of service with distinction. She received the Queen's South Africa Medal, with clasp for South Africa in 1901, confirming her active service during the height of the humanitarian crisis. Although she did not publish a memoir, her newspaper letters remain some of the clearest and most personal descriptions of camp hospital conditions written by any Welsh medical worker during the war. We've talked a little bit about the humanitarian crisis, but I wanted to bring up a couple of personal stories. This is a very short little section of just a couple of examples of two men that fought in the war. One was Thomas Rhys Jones of Aberdare. He had served with the 12th Company of Imperial Yeomanry and wrote letters printed in the Aberdare Leader during 1900, and he described singing Cumranda with fellow Welsh soldiers after a long march, and that the comfort of the Welsh hymns brought them peace during a difficult time in the war. Meanwhile, Corporal Thomas Pugh of Pembrokeshire also sent letters home in 1901, and he wrote of his hopes to return, of the gratitude that he had for all the letters that he'd received, and the exhaustion of constant illness. Unfortunately for him, those illnesses did not go away, and he died of a fever, and he was one of the many who did not actually see combat, but perished of the diseases that had been running rampant throughout South Africa in this period. As you can imagine, the Boer War is one where it is a complicated legacy. It is a point in time which inspired loyalty, grief, political division, and moral questioning. Welsh soldiers fought in famous battles whose names still echo throughout regimental histories. Welsh families mourned losses carved into memorials across the country. Welsh critics challenged the government and sometimes paid the price in public hostility. Welsh nurses and activists shaped the humanitarian response that influenced the national debate. And it is really through the work of these women that we really got the first understanding of just how badly things were going for civilians. And it is important to keep that in mind because so often in the past, we've ignored the response of women. We've ignored their contribution to history simply because the writers of that history didn't care. And we're now seeing what their influence is and how it can actually starkly change what's being discussed about the war and who is involved in the war and what could happen in the worst aspects of warfare. And I think it was an important part of convincing people, much like if you think of the Crimean War, we had Florence Nightingale and all the nurses and various women who worked in that war had influence on a lot of things that changed about the British military. This had much more influence on how civilians should be treated, how the position of the British military was seen not as a glorious one, but rather something to be regretted. And I think in a way, it fought back against the ideals of an era where, might made right most of the time. So it definitely had influence. And through the letters, the diaries, the chapel recordings, and the newspapers, we can see that war was not only an imperial conflict, but also deeply personal for the Welsh experience. These voices helped us to understand just how distant war reshaped communities far from the battlefields and left memories that endured long after the guns fell silent. And for a lot of the colonies of Britain who were starting to become countries, this was the first war where many of them came into it as a country rather than being just a colony of Britain. And it started, I think, the whole movement away from being dominated by British rule for places like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the first dominions, as they were called. They started to see a different side of being a part of the British Empire, and there began to be discussions about separating themselves to a degree from the British Empire while still being members of it. And it is something that will go on all through this century. The discussions of colonialism, the excesses and extremes of it, and how best to deal with it, and how those who were dominated had come to accept that situation or, in a lot of cases, resist that situation. World War I will also introduce a lot more on this particular subject, especially with places like India and an area that will eventually be called Pakistan, and a lot of the British imperial holdings in Africa will suddenly become much more concerned, I guess, about their place in this empire that they've been, in a lot of cases, forced into, and kind of how that reflects on them and on everyone else is something we'll probably discuss in further detail. Certainly not to the degree of, say, someone who's covering it for an actual podcast about that area, but we will do our best to at least do some justice to that kind of thing. With all that, I'd like to thank you once again for listening. If you have questions, comments, or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can always reach out to me on any one of my social media, usually at Welsh History Pod, except for Facebook, where it's the one that's different, which is facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And as well, You can always find us on places like LinkedIn under similar titles. And finally, if you'd like to help contribute to this podcast, if you want to help make a difference to the podcast research, you can do so at patreon.com/Welsh history. Thank you once again. We'll talk to you later. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.